They said she was worth exactly 40 silver weights. Her own mother had counted them out, one by one, into Aldrich Voss's waiting palm at the border gate, while Dante stood in the frost with a satchel of herbs and a silence she had learned long ago was safer than speaking. The gate guards did not look at her. The ledger reader did not look at her. Even the ravens on the palisade fence seemed uninterested in the exchange of one young woman for the clearance of one family's debt. 40 silver weights, the price of a season's grain, or a decent cart horse, or a daughter the world had decided was more burden than blessing. What none of them knew, not Aldrich with his cold arithmetic, not Marit with her practiced absence of expression, not the border settlement that would absorb Dante like water absorbs a dropped stone, was that a Lycan king had been searching for her particular scent for 10 years. That his search had worn through 7 packs, 4 winters, and the last of his patience. That the trail had gone cold twice and been recovered twice, always moving west, always faint as wood smoke after rain. They would know it soon enough. In the year of the ash moon, in the deepest cold the border marches had seen in a generation, the 40 silver weights were counted. The ledger was closed, and Dante Stormborn walked through the gate into a life that did not yet understand what it had received. If you have ever been handed to someone like a settled account, stay with this story. The border settlement of Vosshold sat where 2 frozen rivers met, a place of permanent gray light and permanent mud that winter had locked into ridges hard as old bone. The keep at its center was squat and practical, built for the cold and not for grace, its stone the color of the sky above it. Dante had crossed the border marches before, on herb-gathering runs with Senna, the pack's senior healer, who had trained her hands and her nose and the careful machinery of her attention since she was old enough to tell yarrow from poison hemlock. She knew the territory. She did not know it as a permanent address. Senna was waiting at the inner gate when Aldrich's men brought Dante through. She was a broad-shouldered woman past 50, her gray braid looped twice and pinned at the nape of her neck, her healer's satchel worn at her left hip from decades of the same reach. She said nothing to the guards. She stepped forward, took Dante's satchel from her, passed it back with both their hands briefly on the strap, and said quietly, "I asked for you specifically." He agreed. "That is the best protection I could arrange." It was not much. Dante understood that. She nodded once and let Senna lead her into the keep. She was classed as a ward det, which in Vosshold meant she occupied a rung above servant and below guest, with duties toward the sick in the settlement's low stone infirmary and no particular freedom of movement after the evening bell. Aldrich Voss was a tall man, wide through the chest, with the manner of someone who had never been told no by anyone he respected. He looked at Dante the first time with the frank measuring attention of a man assessing new property, found whatever he was looking for, and moved on without a word. The look left a cold mark between her shoulder blades that she could not quite locate or name. Senna showed her the infirmary, the herb storage, the water supply that ran from a cistern fed by the Western River. Dante noted the cistern immediately, the way the water came through, the faint mineral smell of the stone channel, the places where sediment could collect. It was habit. Senna had taught her to assess any water source she might use for preparation, and the habit ran as deep as breathing by now. The first week passed in the cold regularity of healer's work. Dante set a border scout's broken wrist, cleared an infection in an elderly woman's leg wound, prepared the standard fever reduction tinctures Senna kept in supply. She did not think about her mother. She tried not to think about her mother. The 40 silver weights sat in her chest like a stone she kept pressing her tongue against and then refusing to taste. On the 8th day of her residence in Vosshold, Senna appeared at the infirmary door in the middle of the night and said, "There is a prisoner in the deep cell. He has been there for 4 days. I have been denied access. Tonight, Aldrich's house guard is short 2 men for the watch change, and the door is not locked from the outside. Dante looked up from the tincture she was straining. Fever? She said. By the sound of his breathing, yes. And something else. Something I cannot identify from the passage. Dante thought about the order that had kept Senna out for 4 days. She thought about what manner of prisoner required a deliberately unmanned watch change to be reached. Then she lifted her lamp, took her kit, and followed Senna down. The deep cell was carved into the bedrock beneath the keep's oldest foundation stones. The air at the bottom of the stair was cold enough to make the lamp flame lean sideways, and the smell was iron and stone and something else, something organic and faintly bitter that stopped Dante 2 steps from the door. She recognized that smell. It was faint, diluted, absorbed into the straw and the stone around it, but she recognized it. Wolfsbane, dissolved in water. She stood very still for a moment, the lamp warm in her hand, the smell unwinding through her memory. Senna had shown her wolfsbane's properties in the first month of her training, a careful demonstration with dried leaves and a measured amount of water. The way the alkaloids settled and discolored the liquid faintly, the specific blue-gray cast it left on the sediment at the cup's bottom. It suppressed a Lycan's higher faculties slowly, across administrations, not killing but fogging, blurring the edge between intention and confusion. 3 administrations across 6 days, Senna had said, would reduce even a strong wolf to something between sleep and waking. The prisoner had been here for 4 days. She pushed the cell door open. He was chained to the far wall by 4 anchor points, silver-threaded iron running from wrists to the iron ring set deep in the stone, the same chain looping across his chest and down to ankle brackets. The silver worked through the iron like frost through old wood, and where it pressed against his skin it had left marks, darkened and slow to heal. He was on his knees by default, his head bowed, his breathing the labored, shallow rhythm of a body working too hard to maintain a temperature it should have managed without effort. He was the largest man Dante had ever been in the same room with. She crossed the cell and knelt in front of him and put the back of her hand against his forehead the way Senna had taught her, reading the heat not just with her palm, but with the skin's precise nerve endings. The fever was high, not yet fatal, but moving in that direction. His hair was dark and fell forward, and she could not see his face clearly. She opened her kit. She worked methodically, the way Senna had trained her to work in conditions where haste made error and error killed. She prepared the wolfsbane counteractant from the supplies in her kit, dried root of white bryony and the pressed herb she had always called by its settlement name, bitter leaf, ground together and dissolved in the clean water from her own flask rather than from any vessel belonging to the cell. She checked his wrists where the silver had burned, applied the drawing salve, checked his breathing again. She was reaching to tilt his head back and administer the tincture when he inhaled. It was not a conscious act. It was the body doing what the body does even under suppression, even chained and feverish, and reduced to a fraction of its capacity. He breathed in, and something in the breathing changed, deepened, went still in the way that a hunter goes still when a scent resolves from general air into something specific and known. His hands, loose at the chain's length, closed slowly. Then his head lifted, and she saw his face. The scar ran from his left cheekbone to his jaw, old and healed and carrying the particular quality of a wound taken in a fight of sufficient consequence that no one had dressed it cleanly at the time. His eyes, when they opened, were the color of storm water over stone, and they found her face with a precision that made no sense for a man in his condition. And then something behind those eyes went absolutely still. She had the odd and irrational sensation of having been recognized by someone who knew more about her than she yet knew about herself. "Drink this," she said, because she could not say anything else useful. He drank. She came back the following night, and the night after that. 3 nights of the counteractant, carefully administered, carefully timed, while the wolfsbane's accumulated presence thinned in his system and the fever moved back from its high point towards something her hands could track as improvement. She learned his breathing patterns the way she learned all her patients, by attending. She noted the points at which his cognition seemed to sharpen, the questions he asked in a voice that came back to itself incrementally, the careful way he moved within the chain's range as though cataloging what was possible, rather than straining against what was not. He did not ask her name until the 3rd night. "Dante," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them made the cell warmer than it had any right to be. "How did you identify the taint in the water?" he said. "My mentor showed me. She trained me to assess any water source I work from." She was resealing the preparation vial, not looking at him. "You should know that the man keeping you here plans to use you. I don't know exactly how, but men who chain kings don't do it out of principle." Another silence. "What makes you certain I am a king?" he said. She looked up at him then. The storm-water eyes held steady. "Because no one chains a warlord's lieutenant with silver-threaded iron and 4 anchor points," she said. "And because the warlord upstairs has been particularly anxious since your arrival, and men like that are only anxious when the thing they have captured has the capacity to destroy them." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite amusement, something adjacent to it that had not been on his face a moment before. "You should leave the settlement," he said, "before he uses you as well." She closed her kit. "Tell me something useful I can act on." She did not know, not yet, what the stillness behind his eyes meant. She had not allowed herself to know. There was a scent in that cell that she kept rationalizing as the herbs she brought with her. The preparation chemicals, the particular combination of old stone and cold iron and his proximity, and she kept rationalizing it because the alternative was something her understanding had no framework for, a pulling warmth that started in the center of her chest and moved outward against her will every time she was within arm's reach of him. If you have been watching and want to stay for the end of this, the assembled witnesses will need you present. Keep watching. On the morning of the 12th day of Dante's residence in Voss Hold, Aldrich summoned her to the Great Hall. The hall was built for display, with the pack banners hung in the cold air above a long stone dais, and a fire large enough to be a signal beacon, and Aldrich stood before it with his hands clasped at the small of his back, and the particular satisfaction of a man about to announce something he has been composing for some time. His enforcer, Breck, stood to his right. A quiet man with a ledger keeper's patience and a history Dante could not read from his face. She had seen Breck near the cistern twice in the past week. She had not yet decided what that meant. "You have been a useful addition to the infirmary," Aldrich said. "Senna speaks well of you." He let that sit for a moment. "In 3 days you will participate in a formal bonding claim ceremony before the Border Assembly. You will be named as my ward bond. The ceremony carries the weight of a provisional mate claim and will, once witnessed by the Assembly, establish my standing as primary claimant in any succession dispute that might arise from a chained foreign king's incapacity." Dante kept her face arranged. "And if I decline?" she said. Aldrich smiled with one side of his mouth. "You are a ward debt with 40 silver weights of obligation recorded against your name in my ledger. Declining is not among the options available to you." He dismissed her. She walked back to the infirmary and stood for a moment with her hands flat on the preparation table, the cold stone under her palms, thinking. The bonding claim ceremony. A provisional mate claim before the Border Assembly, witnessed, recorded, binding as any contract written in pack law. It would neutralize the Lycan king's claim right precisely because a witnessed bond stood between him and any formal challenge. Aldrich did not need to kill him. He only needed to make him legally irrelevant. She thought about the wolfsbane taint in the cistern. She thought about Breck near the cistern. She thought about 3 administrations across 6 days. She went to find Senna. Senna was in the herb storage behind the infirmary, doing nothing in particular with a bunch of dried rosemary, which meant she had been waiting to be found. Breck manages the household water distribution, Senna said, before Dante spoke. He has done so for 6 years. And the cistern feeds the deep cell's water supply, Dante said. Senna set down the rosemary. Her face was very careful. I cannot be the one to bring this forward, she said. Aldrich would remove me from the settlement, and there are 37 people in this infirmary's care who would lose their only healer. I know, Dante said. She went back to the deep cell that night, the 4th night, outside her established pattern. He was alert now in a way he had not been on the first visit. The fog largely cleared, the chain's 4 anchor points still holding, but his posture against the wall no longer collapsed. He looked at her when she came in with the particular attention of someone whose faculties have returned enough to be actively employed. She told him about the ceremony. She told him about the cistern and Breck. He listened without interrupting, which she had begun to understand was a deliberate practice rather than passivity. When she finished, he said, "You are telling me this, rather than using the knowledge to negotiate your own departure. I am telling you this because it is the right information for you to have. You could leave tonight. With this, you have something to trade." I could, she said, but Senna cannot leave, and the people in the infirmary cannot leave, and if Aldrich goes forward with a false bond ceremony before the assembly, no one in this settlement will be able to challenge it afterward. He was quiet for long enough that the lamp between them burned through a noticeable portion of the oil. You were traded here for 40 silver weights, he said. It was not a question. My mother owed a debt, she said, in the tone she used when she needed a fact to sound smaller than it was. He said nothing more on that subject. What he felt in that moment she could not have read from his face, but something behind his eyes pulled tight in a way that the scar on his jaw did not soften. He told her about the origin of his search. Not at length, not with the elaboration of a man wanting sympathy, but in the plain disclosing way of someone transferring necessary information. A mate elder of his court had died in the autumn 10 years ago. In the last hours, she had pressed his hand and said the thread was still alive, the bond scent was still moving west, that the line of the old border pack, the one Aldrich's father had absorbed and renamed and registered out of existence, had not ended with the registration, that there was a woman who carried it, that she would not know what she carried. The old border pack, the one absorbed and renamed. Dante sat with that for a moment. My father's name was Stormborn, she said. The chains held. His hands did not move. His eyes did not change. Only the stillness deepened in a way she was beginning to be able to read as its own form of expression. Yes, he said. She lay awake in the infirmary that night with the lamp burning low and the wind outside testing the keep's old mortar, and thought about her wolf, which had been silent since she was 7 years old, which she had stopped expecting to hear, which her mother had taken as evidence of worthlessness in the way that people sometimes take the silencing of something they damaged as proof that it was never there. She had not let herself think about it as something other than absence for a very long time. The bonding claim ceremony was held at midday in the council circle, the outdoor ring of standing stones at the keep's western edge where border pack law required witnessed rituals to be performed. The border assembly had gathered, 50 or so wolves from the settlement and the neighboring pack territories, their breath fogging in the cold noon air, the stone pillars casting their winter shadows. Aldrich stood at the circle's head in his formal wolf-gray coat, with his house seal at the collar. Breck stood to his right. Senna stood at the assembly's edge, near the circle's eastern entrance. Dante was brought out by 2 of Aldrich's guards, her hands unbound, but the guard's positioning making the compulsion visible to everyone present. She was wearing the settlement's formal dress for claimed wards, gray wool, a border trim of Aldrich's house color at the collar, a garment that said what she was in Aldrich's accounting before she opened her mouth. At the back of the crowd, at the edge of the circle where the assembly was thinner, she saw a child, perhaps 6 years old, a girl who had been in the infirmary 3 days prior with a chest cold, now recovered and apparently accompanying an older relative to the ceremony. The child was too close to Aldrich's left side of the circle, where the guards were tightest, and where Aldrich himself was most likely to move when the ritual speaking began. Aldrich raised his right hand. "We are gathered to witness," he said in the carrying voice pack leaders used for formal ritual, "the provisional bond claim of the ward Dante Stormborn, registered debt of this hold, to the standing of mate ward to Aldrich Voss, Alpha of Voss Hold, before this assembly and under the law of the border marches, such claim to carry full succession weight in any dispute of throne right or border territory that may subsequently arise." The assembled wolves were quiet in the way crowds go quiet when something is both ceremonially anticipated and privately uneasy. Aldrich stepped forward toward Dante, and from beneath the great hall, from somewhere below the frozen earth of the council circle, there was a sound like 4 iron anchor rings being pulled from old stone by a force that the stone was not sufficient to argue with. The sound traveled through the ground before it reached the air. Several people in the assembly felt it in their boot soles before they heard it. Aldrich turned, and then Dante heard something else. Something she had not heard in 15 years. Something that started so deep in her chest that it took her a moment to understand it was not external but interior. Her own wolf, the one that had been silent since childhood, pressing upward through whatever internal distance had accumulated between them, like a fire that had been banked rather than extinguished finding its draw again. She had half a second to register this before Aldrich's arm came down, not at her. At the child who had drifted, the girl from the infirmary, who had moved too close to the circle's inner edge and was directly in the path of his swing. Dante moved. She did not decide to move. Her body was already between Aldrich's arm and the child by the time the decision would have arrived. The blow struck her across the left shoulder and drove her sideways, and she caught the child against her right side and held her. And the assembly made a sound, a collective inhale that had nothing ceremonial in it. The sound of people who understand they have just witnessed something that cannot be unmade. From behind her, at the circle's northern entrance, came the sound of the deep cell stairs, the sound of chains still attached to their anchor rings but trailing, 4 lengths of silver-threaded iron dragging across frozen stone, and then the sound of a man for whom the fog had fully cleared, walking into the council circle in front of 50 witnesses. Cassian Drave, scarred, unchained now, the broken anchor rings still attached at wrist and ankle, but the silver-threaded iron hanging free from limbs that had decided the chains were not, in fact, more powerful than what had just been done to the woman who had kept him alive. The assembly parted. It was not entirely voluntary. It was the thing that happens when the pressure in a room reorganizes itself around a new center. People who have practiced hierarchy long enough move aside from apex force without being asked, the way water makes room for a stone dropped into it. He walked to where Dante stood with the child still held against her right side, and he stood between her and Aldrich, and he did not have to say anything for the nature of the situation to be entirely clear to everyone present. Aldrich said, with admirable composure for a man who had just watched his prisoner walk out of the deep cell, "You are in violation of this assembly's legal claim procedure. Whatever my ward debt has done in your cell is a matter of property management, and it does not supersede the witnessed bonding claim in progress." "Your witnessed bonding claim," Cassian said, "requires a ward free of prior standing. Your enforcer has been administering wolfsbane through the household water for 3 administrations across 6 days, which constitutes assault against a foreign pact's sovereign under border treaty law. The treatment that cleared the assault from my system was performed by this woman at cost to her own safety, using knowledge she should not have needed to apply." He turned to the assembly. not dramatically, simply facing them, the way a man faces a room he is responsible for. "Breck," he said. One of the assembly's guards near the outer circle moved, not at Cassian's order, but at the wave of recognition that went through the crowd when a name is said with that weight in that context. Breck turned to run and found 3 wolves between him and the exit that had not been there a moment before. He was taken with a minimum of theater. Aldrich reached for the short blade at his belt. The fight was brief. Not because Cassian was the stronger fighter, though he was, but because Aldrich's composure, which was the only real weapon he had left, broke at the moment he understood that no amount of legal ceremony would put the chains back on what was currently standing in his council circle. He struck without sufficient preparation, and Cassian caught the blade hand and ended the matter in a manner that the assembly witnessed clearly, and that pack law recorded as justified response to sovereign assault. Aldrich fell on the frozen stones of his own council circle. In the silence that followed, Senna walked forward from the assembly's edge. She crossed the circle to where Dante stood and placed both her hands briefly on Dante's uninjured shoulder, and then she stepped back and stood beside her rather than behind her, which was itself a statement. The false bond had never been completed. The words had not been finished. Pack law was specific on this point, witness completion being the requirement, and the only thing the assembly had witnessed to completion was Dante stepping between a child and a warlord's arm. But there was something else. It began at the edges of Dante's hands, the ones that had administered the wolfsbane counteractant on 3 separate nights, the ones that had caught the child and taken the blow, meant for her. A light, low at first, the color of old gold, the color of autumn light on water. Not dramatic, patient, the way things long suppressed are when they finally surface. Her wolf, awake, after 15 years, awake. The light moved up her arms and the assembly felt it as they had felt the chains breaking through the ground, in the body before the eyes, a vibration that settled into recognition. The old border pack bloodline, registered out of existence by Aldrich's father, absorbed into the hold's records as ward debt, common property, not worth more than 40 silver weights to a woman who had never understood what she was counting when she counted her daughter. The border assembly understood what they were looking at. Cassian turned to her. He had not touched her. The chains were still trailing from his wrists, the silver-burned marks still on his skin. He stood in front of her and looked at her the way he had looked at her in the deep cell when he first opened his eyes, with the precision of a man at the end of a 10-year search, and the thing she had been rationalizing as the smell of her own herbs was present now, in a way that all the rationalizing in the world was insufficient to account for. A warmth, and a pull, and a certainty that occupied the same space in her chest where her wolf had just resumed residence. He said, not in the formal proclamation register, but in the direct, unelaborated way she had come to understand, was his most honest voice. "You came to me in a cell when you had no obligation to. You treated what they were doing to me when it put you at risk. You knew what I was, and told me the truth anyway." A pause. "Whatever the Assembly's records say about your standing, I know what scent brought me to this territory. I know what scent I have been following for 10 years. He went down on one knee on the frozen cobblestones of the council circle. The assembly went with him, not all at once, not in the synchronized way of rehearsed ceremony, but in the rolling, uneven way of people who arrive at a recognition they did not plan for and act on it before their hesitation can talk them out of it. One by one, then in clusters, then the remainder, until 50 wolves of the border assembly were kneeling on the frozen ground of Voss Hold, in the council circle where 40 silver weights worth of a daughter had been offered and used, and struck across the left shoulder and had still not broken. Dante did not know what her face was doing. She was aware of the child still at her right side, small and warm. She was aware of Senna standing behind her left shoulder. She was aware that the light from her hands was subsiding, not extinguishing, settling into her skin the way a newly banked fire settles, present and steady. She was aware of the scarred king on one knee before her and the assembly he had brought down with him. Her mother was at the assembly's outer edge. Marit Stormborn had arrived with one of the border territory delegations, the kind of attendance that pack law made advisable when a formal bond claim was being witnessed, and she had been standing in the crowd through all of it. Her face, when Dante found it, was the face of a woman doing arithmetic she had not expected to need, calculating what 40 silver weights had purchased and what it had failed to account for. Before Dante could speak, Aldrich's ledger reader, a young man with the careful habits of someone who has survived several holders by making himself useful to whoever holds the records, stepped forward from the assembly. He had the ledger open. He had apparently decided that the moment required the facts read aloud. Ward debt, Dante Stormborn, 40 silver weights, recorded as full discharge of the Stormborn family debt, entered in the register of Voss Hold in the year of the Ash Moon. He read, in the carrying voice of formal record, in front of the entire assembled border crowd. Entered by authority of Marit Stormborn, acting guardian. The ward's lineage noted as common, no prior standing, no pack affiliation. He paused. The assembly had 50 wolves present and 40 of them were still kneeling. Maret's pack standing was stripped before the end of the day. Not by Cassian's decree, not by anything requiring additional ceremony. The Border Assembly's law was direct on the matter of false registration and deliberate misrepresentation of bloodline, particularly when the misrepresentation had been used to execute a debt trade. 2 of the territory elders cited the specific statute. Marit left Voss Hold before the evening bell in the company of the delegation she had arrived with, and none of them were speaking to her, and her name did not appear in the Hold's formal records again. Senna was restored to senior healer's rank that evening, not by petition, but by the simple fact that the Hold's new political reality required someone to manage the infirmary, and everyone present understood that Senna had been the actual authority there, regardless of what the ledger said. She received the formal notation in the register with the composed satisfaction of a woman who had arranged to be at the right gate at the right time and was not surprised by the outcome. The bond's completion was not a ceremony. Dante had had enough of ceremonies performed in stone circles for other people's benefit. It was quieter than that. It was Cassian asking her, in the Hold's great hall, with only Senna and 2 of his own recovered guard as witness, whether she would accept the acknowledgement, and Dante saying yes, not because she was obliged to, not because her wolf was awake and pressing warmth through her sternum like a coal through thin cloth, but because she had learned in a deep cell, across 3 nights of careful work, that honesty about the thing in front of you was the only practice that held when everything else was unreliable. The gold light came back when their hands met, not dramatic, not the sudden flare of a thing announced. A slow, even illumination, the kind that reveals everything in a room without burning anything. It moved through the joined hands and up, and where Cassian's silver-burned wrists had been slow to heal, the marks cleared in the space of that light passing across them, not erased, but resolved. The way a wound closes when the body has finally been given what it needed. She felt her wolf settle, not the desperate awakening of the council circle, not the strained emergence of something long suppressed and suddenly urgent, settled, present, her own. The Border Assembly held a formal recognition 3 days later in the Great Hall rather than the council circle, and that is where Dante Stormborn was elevated before the gathered delegates as Cassian's acknowledged bond queen. The kneeling was formal this time, planned, the delegates descending one by one in the long hall's firelight, the pack banners above them carrying Aldrich's house color that would be replaced by the month's end. Senna stood at Dante's right through all of it. Afterward, when the hall had cleared enough to breathe, Dante walked the Hold's outer passage to the deep cell stair, not to descend, just to stand at the top of it. The passage was cold, The anchor rings were still in the wall at the stair's bottom, the broken chain ends lying on the stone floor where they had been dropped. Someone had set a torch in the passage bracket, and the light went down the stairs in warm, irregular pulses. She stood there for a moment with her left hand resting on the stair's stone frame, the frame she had passed through 4 times with a lamp and a kit, and the fixed intention of a woman who could not leave a feverish patient alone in a cell, regardless of what the arrangement cost her. From the great hall behind her came the sound of the evening's gathering, voices and firelight, and the ordinary noise of a settlement at its work. The wolf in her chest breathed. She turned away from the stair and walked back toward the light.